Yesterday, the highest court in the United States delivered a ruling that instantly changed how the world reads Washington's trade threats. The U.S. Supreme Court struck down President Donald Trump's sweeping global tariffs, ruling that the White House did not have the legal authority under the emergency law it relied on to impose them. That might sound like a legal technicality until you track what tariffs actually do. They move through ports and supply chains into company pricing and finally into household costs. They reshape bargaining power between allies and rivals. And because the U.S. sits at the center of global demand, a tariff shock doesn't stay American for long. The court's decision was also a message about power, not just trade. Reuters reported the ruling was 6-3 and that the dispute centered on the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, a law designed for national emergencies. The court said that law did not give a president the sweeping authority to impose broad import tariffs on nearly all trading partners. Chief Justice John Roberts wrote the majority opinion, emphasizing that tariff powers rest with Congress and cannot be expanded through an emergency shortcut without clear authorization. This matters for global markets because it changes the durability of U.S. tariff policy. When tariffs are built on legal foundations that courts can remove, the world has to price not only the tariff itself, but the chance it disappears, and the chance it returns under a different law. That whiplash is destabilizing because companies plan around probability, not promises. Even a short-lived tariff threat can push firms to front-load shipments, rewrite contracts, and delay investment. The money question is just as explosive. Reuters reported the ruling ends over $175 billion in tariff collections tied to the struck-down policy and raises immediate questions about refunds and how claims could work. For businesses, this isn't abstract. If a company paid duties at the border under a policy now deemed unlawful, that company will want clarity on what it can recover, when, and through what process. For governments, the situation is equally sensitive. A refund wave would be financially and politically significant, while uncertainty over refunds can keep supply chain decisions frozen. But the most important part of this story is what happened just after the ruling, because it shows how quickly trade policy can pivot from courtroom to counterstrike. Yesterday afternoon, Trump signaled a fresh tariff move, a new global import tariff of 10% described as temporary, using a different legal authority. Reuters reported he said he would sign an order for the new tariff and indicated additional trade-related investigations were also being launched. That pivot is the new trade war reality. One pathway gets blocked, another opens. And for everyone outside the United States, from Ottawa to Tokyo to Seoul, the key question becomes less, what did the court say? And more, what does Washington do next, and how fast can it do it? This morning, the immediate international reaction was uncertainty, not relief. Reuters reported Asian economies were weighing the impact of Trump's fresh tariff moves amid confusion, precisely because the court ruling and the new tariff signal arrived almost back-to-back. The ruling may have reduced tariff pressure on paper, but the new announcement reintroduced risk, especially for export-heavy economies tied into U.S.-bound supply chains. That's why global markets treat this as more than a U.S. political fight. A big exporter doesn't need a tariff to actually start tomorrow to feel the effects today. The expectation alone can reroute orders, change inventory decisions, and push manufacturers to accelerate shipments before barriers potentially rise. Reuters noted the uncertainty is being felt by major Asian exporters that anchor global tech and industrial supply chains. Now bring Canada into the frame, because Canada is both a major trade partner and one of America's closest security allies, which makes tariff conflict far more than an economic dispute. Earlier this month, Reuters reported the U.S. House of Representatives narrowly backed a resolution to end tariffs imposed on Canadian goods in a rare rebuke to Trump. The vote was 219 to 211, with a small number of Republicans joining nearly all Democrats. Even if such measures face steep political obstacles, the signal matters. Congressional resistance is part of the tariff battlefield. In other words, the pressure isn't only international. It's domestic, institutional, and legal, courts, Congress, and the White House pulling in different directions, while companies and governments try to plan in real time. Canada's challenge is strategic. If Washington's tariff posture is unstable, struck down in court, replaced by a new tariff route, contested in Congress, Ottawa must decide how to respond without overreacting. Retaliation can escalate. Negotiation can look like weakness, and waiting can be costly if tariffs return suddenly. Canada also has to consider broader alignment, how trade tension affects joint economic resilience, and how much political capital gets consumed by a fight that spills into wider geopolitical cooperation. Zoom out, and the global meaning becomes sharper. The Supreme Court decision tightened the legal boundaries of emergency-based tariff power, but it didn't remove tariff politics from the system. Trump's immediate pivot signaled a continued willingness to pursue broad tariff pressure through alternative statutes and investigations. And the international reaction, especially across Asia, shows that even when one set of tariffs is invalidated, uncertainty can grow if a replacement appears instantly, forcing governments and markets to reassess risk again. That's the tightening loop the world is watching right now. Courts define limits, leaders test new routes, partners prepare countermeasures, and markets reprice the entire trade environment, often before a single new container is taxed. And in that environment, rules tightening doesn't automatically mean stability. It can also mean the fight shifts to new legal tools, faster timelines, and higher geopolitical stakes. Just now, the focus across boardrooms isn't celebration, it's paperwork and timing. After the Supreme Court wiped out the emergency law foundation for Trump's broad tariffs, companies that paid duties are immediately looking at what comes next, because the victory only matters if the money and the rules actually unwind. Reuters reported businesses and industry groups welcomed the decision, but also warned that refunds could be complicated and slow, with logistics and legal processes likely to drag on while agencies and courts clarify next steps. That refund uncertainty is not a small technical issue. When importers don't know whether they'll recover past payments or how quickly, they can't confidently price goods, commit to contracts, or plan inventory. Large retailers and manufacturers have to decide whether to lock in shipments, delay orders, or reroute supply chains. And each choice changes demand for shipping, warehousing, and financing. Reuters noted that even with relief from the ruling, many companies are bracing for a messy transition period because the tariff system doesn't reset instantly just because a court ruling lands. In the background, a deeper concern is building. If the United States is now likely to pivot from one legal authority to another, companies may be stuck in a cycle of short-lived rules that still carry real costs. A tariff can alter behavior the moment it is announced because firms rush to beat a deadline, stockpile goods, or shift suppliers preemptively. Even if a later court challenge succeeds, the economic distortion has already happened. That's why the ruling, while major, doesn't automatically translate into stability. That uncertainty intensified almost immediately when Trump pivoted to a new tariff approach. Reuters reported that following the Supreme Court setback, Trump moved to replace the struck-down duties with a temporary 10% global tariff and signaled additional trade probes, attempting to reestablish leverage through different statutes. This is where the story stops being law versus policy and becomes policy as pressure. Tariffs are not only about revenue, they are also tools to force renegotiation, reshape supply chains, and signal power. But when the tools keep changing, the cost is borne first by firms trying to operate in real time, and then by consumers as uncertainty filters into prices. Reuters described how companies, even while applauding the court's decision, we're already preparing for the next phase because the administration's trade posture can shift rapidly when it is driven by executive action and political urgency. This morning, outside the United States, governments are reacting less to the court's constitutional message and more to the practical question: what does Washington enforce next, and how broad is the blast radius? Reuters reported that across Asia, trading partners were weighing new uncertainty and confusion after the court ruling invalidated many tariffs, only for Trump to announce a fresh 10% import tariff on all countries for a set period using different legal authority. For export-heavy economies linked to global tech and industrial supply chains, even a temporary universal tariff can trigger immediate defensive behavior. Companies may accelerate shipments to the United States to beat implementation windows, which can create short spikes in freight demand and distort inventory levels. Governments, meanwhile, have to decide how to respond without triggering escalation that damages their own exporters. Reuters reported reactions varied, with officials in places like Japan signaling they would review developments carefully, while others voiced concern about rising uncertainty. The key point is that the court ruling lowered one barrier, but the new tariff signal quickly rebuilt risk. That's why markets and governments are not treating this as a clean tariffs end moment. They're treating it as a shift from one legal framework to another, which is exactly the environment where trade war fears can reappear fast. In Canada, the stakes are uniquely sharp because the relationship sits at the crossroads of economics and alliance politics. When tariffs hit Canada, it's not just a trade dispute with a distant rival, it's pressure inside one of the world's closest cross-border economies. Earlier, Reuters reported the U.S. House narrowly backed a resolution to end tariffs imposed on Canadian goods in a rare rebuke to Trump, an unusual sign of domestic political friction over using emergency powers in a dispute involving a close partner. That vote is important even if it doesn't immediately change policy because it highlights a second battlefield alongside the courts: Congress. If Congress pushes back, it complicates tariff durability. If Congress aligns, it can harden trade action into longer-lasting law. For allies like Canada, that creates a strategic dilemma. Waiting for the U.S. system to resolve itself can reduce the chance of overreaction, but it can also leave Canadian industries exposed to sudden shifts. Retaliation can protect domestic credibility but risks escalation. Negotiation can diffuse tension but may cost political leverage. In a fast-moving tariff environment, every choice carries both economic consequences and geopolitical signaling. Across the Atlantic, a similar dynamic is forming. Relief that one set of tariffs may be constrained, mixed with anxiety that the next set could arrive through a different route. Reuters reported that for European companies, tariff relief came with what it called a sting in the tail, because firms still face uncertainty about what replaces the invalidated measures and how quickly the U.S. trade stance could tighten again. This is where the global rules tighten theme becomes real. The Supreme Court decision draws a legal boundary on emergency tariff power, reinforcing that sweeping tariff authority must be clearly grounded in law. But the political response points in the opposite direction: an effort to find alternative legal tools to sustain broad tariff pressure, paired with new investigations that could justify future sector-based measures. That combination can tighten global trade rules in practice by increasing compliance burdens, elevating uncertainty premiums, and encouraging companies to diversify away from the most exposed routes. In other words, even when a court restricts one mechanism, the broader system can still evolve toward more friction if governments keep searching for different levers. Right now, the world is watching three moving parts at once. Courts are defining limits on executive trade power. Political leadership is testing new routes to keep tariff pressure alive. And U.S. partners are trying to decide whether this is a temporary shock or the start of a more permanent era of tariff volatility. That is why this moment matters beyond the headlines. The global economy doesn't need a full trade war to feel trade war effects. It only needs enough uncertainty to change behavior. When companies rush shipments, delay investment, and rewrite supply contracts, the consequences ripple through jobs, prices, and growth expectations. And when allies like Canada face shifting U.S. tariff posture while also managing broader security and geopolitical cooperation, trade becomes a pressure point that can spill into wider negotiations. For viewers, the conclusion is simple but serious. Yesterday's Supreme Court ruling tightened the legal boundaries around emergency tariffs and reasserted that sweeping tariff power cannot be assumed without clear authorization. But today's reality is that the tariff agenda is not ending. It's evolving, with new temporary measures and fresh probes already shaping how markets and governments plan. The next phase will be defined by how quickly the U.S. can enforce new tariffs, how effectively partners like Canada and major Asian exporters respond, and whether Congress becomes a stronger check or a stronger amplifier of tariff policy.